Walt Braddock had been wrong about a lot of things in his life. He had been wrong about his first marriage, wrong about re-enlisting the third time, wrong about a card game in Bahrain that cost him $600 and 2 weeks of dignity. He had been wrong about weather, about officers, about which missions would be easy and which ones would tear something out of you that never grew back. But in 22 years of special operations, Walt Braddock had never once been wrong about a person. Not once. Until that night. The timestamp reads 2:47 a.m. The location is classified. What you need to know is this. It was a forward operating base in the southwestern desert, a patch of earth so remote that the nearest paved road was 40 minutes away by truck and the nearest city was a rumor. The base had no official name on any document that mattered. The men who lived and worked there called it FOB Kestrel because someone years ago had seen a small falcon hunting mice along the perimeter fence and thought the name suited the place. Efficient, quiet, built for survival in hostile terrain. On most nights, Kestrel was exactly that. On this night, it was something closer to a last stand. You have to understand what it looks like when a SEAL team comes back wrong. There is a way operators move when a mission has gone well. It is not celebration. It is not swagger. It is a specific kind of controlled quiet, the calm of men who have done something hard and survived it cleanly and are already thinking about the next thing. Their gear is arranged. Their weapons are on safe. They debrief in low voices, and they eat whatever is available, and they sleep like men who have earned it. That is not what came through the gates of FOB Kestrel at 2:47 a.m. What came through the gates was different. 12 men reduced from the original 14, moving in the hunched, deliberate way that speaks not of control but of exhaustion so deep it has moved past the body and settled into the bones. 3 of them were supporting wounded teammates. 1 man was being carried. Their magazines were nearly empty. You could tell by the way the rifles sat lighter on their slings, by the absence of the small unconscious adjustments that a fully loaded weapon requires. Their faces were caked in dust and something darker. Their eyes carried the specific flatness of people who have been running on adrenaline for too long and have finally, in the relative safety of the gate, allowed themselves to feel the weight of what just happened. The mission had not gone well. What was supposed to be a clean extraction from a compromised position had turned into something else entirely. The ambush had been waiting for them. Not a lucky encounter, a prepared position, coordinated patient. The kind of ambush that does not happen by accident. They had fought through it because that is what these men do, but fighting through it had cost them, and the enemy had not stopped pursuing when it should have. By the time they reached the base, they had almost nothing left. Ammunition, time, options. All 3 were running out together. Commander Cole Hargrove did not waste time meeting them at the gate with words of comfort. That was not who he was. He met them at the gate because he needed to see the situation with his own eyes before he could make any decision that mattered, and what he saw in the first 30 seconds told him everything. He was 45 years old, Hargrove. He had a face that had stopped being young sometime around his 3rd deployment and had settled instead into something more useful, hard-readable, precise. The kind of face that does not perform emotion, but does not hide it either. His men trusted that face because it never lied to them. When things were bad, it showed that things were bad. When there was a way through, it showed that too. Tonight it was very still, which meant he was calculating. He walked through the base toward the command room. His senior operators fell in alongside him without being told. The wounded were taken to the medical station. The others followed the commander. Inside the command room, the lights were low and yellow. Maps covered the central table. Radio equipment lined one wall, most of it crackling with static or carrying fragments of transmissions that didn't yet add up to anything useful. It smelled like every forward command room smelled diesel dust. Old coffee and the particular metallic edge of stress that comes from too many people in a confined space making decisions that have real consequences. Hargrove stood over the map. He looked at the positions, the terrain, the distances. He looked at the timeline. He looked at the resources available to him. Then he raised his head and spoke to the room. Any combat pilots here? It was not a question he expected much from. He knew what Kestrel was. He knew who was stationed here. This was not an air wing base. The men in this room were trained for other things. Water darkness, precision raids, the kind of work that does not require wings. He asked because the situation required him to ask everything to leave no stone unturned, even the stones that were almost certainly empty underneath. The room shifted. Men looked at each other, looked away. Walt Braddock shook his head slowly, not disrespectfully, just honestly. A couple of the younger operators stared at the floor. Nobody spoke. The silence was its own answer. Hargrove nodded once, absorbing it, already moving to the next calculation in his mind. And then from the far end of the room came the sound of a chair scraping against concrete. She had been there the whole time. That was the thing that stayed with Braddock later when he had time to think about it. She had been in the room when they arrived, sitting in the far corner with her back partially to the wall, not hiding exactly but not announcing herself either. She had a small component, a circuit board in her left hand, and had apparently been working on something before the team came through the door. She had stopped when they entered, had listened to everything. But until that chair moved, nobody had paid her much attention. She stood. She was mid-30s, and she had the kind of stillness that you earn rather than inherit. Not tall, not imposing by any physical measure. Her fatigues were standard issue, and worn in the way that working clothes get worn, not distressed for appearance, but genuinely used. There was a streak of grease along her right forearm. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow. Her hair was pulled back with the efficiency of someone who cannot be bothered with it during a long night of maintenance work. She looked in the blunt assessment of several operators in that room like someone who fixed things. Radios, generators, equipment, not someone who flew. When she rose, the Air Force patch on her shoulder caught the light, faded from use. Unmistakably real. "I can fly," she said. 4 words. She did not raise her voice to say them. She did not need to. The room absorbed the statement the way a room absorbs something unexpected, with a beat of pure silence before the reaction begins. And then the reaction began. It was not hostile. These were not men who dealt in cruelty for its own sake. But they were men who had spent careers learning to assess human beings quickly and accurately because their lives depended on those assessments, and what they saw when they looked at her did not immediately match what she was claiming. One of the operators, broad-shouldered, with dried blood on the collar of his jacket that was not his own, leaned forward slightly. "Ma'am," he said, keeping his voice level. "No offense intended, but you look like you've been pulling maintenance all night. You're telling me you can fly a combat aircraft." It was not quite a question. She looked at him steadily. Then she looked back at Hargrove. "You asked if there was a combat pilot in this room," she said. "There is. That's the answer to your question." Hargrove studied her. He had a gift for this, the silent assessment, the reading of a person without giving away what he was reading. He had looked at hundreds of people this way over the decades. Volunteers and recruits and specialists and contractors and soldiers from a dozen different countries. He had learned to distinguish the ones who were telling the truth from the ones who believed they were telling the truth but were wrong, and from the ones who knew they were lying. She was not lying. He was fairly certain of that within 15 seconds. But certainty at 15 seconds was not the same as certainty at the level this situation required. "What do you fly?" he asked. "A 10 Thunderbolt." Something moved through the room, not loud, more like a current beneath the surface. The operators knew that name. Every man who had ever fought on the ground and looked up at the sky in desperation knew that name. The A-10 was not glamorous. It was not the aircraft that appeared in recruitment posters or movie trailers. It was slow by modern standards, ugly by design, and it had been threatened with retirement so many times that its survival had become something of a dark joke among ground forces. But what the A-10 could do, what it had done repeatedly in desert and mountain and jungle, was arrive low and loud and mean over a position where men were dying and change the mathematics of the situation entirely. Its cannon was a sound unlike anything else in the inventory. Ground troops who had experienced it from the friendly side described it as the sound of survival itself. The skepticism in the room did not disappear, but it shifted. It became something with more calculation in it. Braddock pulled Hargrove aside, just far enough that the conversation was between them. He kept his voice low. "Sir, I pulled her personnel file when the team was coming in. Routine." A pause. "Sarah Mercer, Captain USAF, a 10 qualified 2 combat tours, 63 close air support missions." Another pause, longer. "And suspended from flight status 8 months ago. Direct order from the Pentagon. She is not cleared to fly any aircraft. If she takes that plane up tonight, she is violating a standing military order. We are asking her to violate it." Hargrove said nothing for a moment. Then he turned back to the room. Back to her. She had not moved. She had heard none of what Braddock said, but she appeared to understand that something was being discussed about her, and she waited with the particular patience of someone who is accustomed to being deliberated over and has made peace with it. Hargrove walked back to her. "I'm going to ask you something," he said quietly, "and I need a straight answer." "Yes, sir." "You're on suspension. Flight status revoked, Pentagon order. You know I know that now." He watched her face. So you tell me why I should put you in that cockpit. The room had gone very quiet. She looked at him for a moment before she answered. Not collecting herself, she was already collected. Something else. Something closer to deciding how much to say. The order grounded me, she said. It didn't take away what I know how to do. And what I know how to do is the only thing that changes what happens tonight. That's not an answer to my question. It's the only answer that matters right now. Braddock, watching from 6 feet away, felt something he did not expect to feel. Not agreement, not yet, but the beginning of something. A hairline crack in a position he had believed was solid. This is the part that matters before we go further. The part that explains who she was before that room, before that night. Sarah Mercer grew up in a house in rural Colorado where aviation was not a hobby or a career aspiration, it was a language. Her father, Captain James Mercer, flew A-10s out of Davis-Monthan Air Force Base for the better part of 15 years. He was not a famous man. He did not appear in newspapers or documentaries. He was the kind of military aviator who does his job so well and so quietly that history forgets to record it, which is perhaps the truest form of professionalism there is. She grew up with his stories, not war stories exactly. James Mercer was careful about what he brought home and what he kept at the flight line. But flying stories, what it felt like to be low and fast over terrain that wanted to catch you, what the aircraft told you through the controls when it was content and when it was not, what it meant to be overhead when men on the ground needed you to be there. He talked about that last thing the most, and the way he talked about it made her understand even as a child that it was the reason for all the other things. She was 9 years old when he deployed to support NATO operations over Kosovo. She was 9 years old when the notification came. She kept one thing from his belongings. Her mother would have let her keep anything. She chose a small embroidered patch. Number 23 for his squadron. She kept it in a drawer for years. Then in a jacket pocket. Then when she earned her own wings and understood what she had earned, she sewed it into the lining of her flight jacket, close to her chest, where she could touch it without anyone seeing. She never told anyone about the patch. Some things are not for other people. She flew her first combat deployment at 28, her second at 31, 63 close air support missions over 2 tours. She had brought aircraft home with damage that maintenance crews photographed because they could not believe the thing was still flying. She had been the voice on the radio that answered when the men on the ground called for help in the worst moments of their lives. She was 35 years old, and she had not flown in 8 months. The suspension was not a secret, but the reason for it was not widely discussed. What the official record showed was a violation of a direct command during a mission 14 months prior. What the record did not capture or chose not to capture was what the violation had been in service of. A civilian convoy, compromised position, no assets authorized for support. She had been in the area, had seen it on her instruments, had made a decision in approximately 4 seconds. 34 people were alive because of that decision. She had been suspended because of it. She had not appealed. She had come to FOB Kestrel on a maintenance rotation 3 weeks earlier. The A-10 on the strip had been there longer than she had grounded for mechanical reasons, awaiting parts that were slow in coming, sitting under its camouflage netting, like something that had forgotten what it was made for. She had walked past it every day, had run her hand along the fuselage once early in the morning when no one was watching. She had not expected to ever sit in the cockpit again. Hargrove made his decision the way he made most decisions, not fast, not slow, but at exactly the speed the situation allowed. He returned to her. The aircraft on the strip. It's been grounded for weeks. Systems are cold. I know, she said. You're telling me you can bring it up. Yes. And if you're wrong, she looked at him with an expression that was precise and undecorated. If I'm wrong, we are in exactly the same position we're in right now. Nothing lost. If I'm right, your men come home. Braddock cut in from behind the commander's shoulder. Sir, with respect, she hasn't flown in 8 months. She's not in a flight suit. She hasn't been current in almost a year. If she gets up there and something goes wrong... Chief, Hargrove's voice was quiet. It was also final. If you've got a better option somewhere in this room, I want to hear it right now. Braddock said nothing. Hargrove turned back to her. One more question. He had one more question, and the answer to it would close the matter. Call sign, he said. Something moved across her face. Brief enough that most people in the room missed it. Not hesitation, something older than hesitation. Recognition, maybe. The look of a person who carries a name they do not say out loud often because the name belongs to something larger than a single conversation. Valkyrie, she said. The word landed differently from all the others. Braddock felt it. Call signs are not chosen. They are assigned by squadrons, by crews. by the accumulated evidence of who a person becomes under pressure. They stick because they are accurate. Valkyrie was not a name you gave a pilot who was ordinary. Braddock had heard that name before. 3 years ago, a classified action brief that had crossed his desk in a different theater. He had not thought about it again until this exact moment, and now he was thinking about it, and it was changing something in him. Hargrove gave one curt nod. Get to the runway. The room moved. The desert at night in that part of the country has a particular quality of silence that is unlike any other silence. It is not the silence of absence. Things are alive out there in the dark, hunting and being hunted. The ordinary business of the natural world proceeding on its own schedule, regardless of what human beings are arranging nearby. But the sound of it is low and spread thin under the enormous sky, and it creates the impression of stillness that has actual weight. She walked through it toward the runway with two operators flanking her and Hargrove behind. The Warthog sat at the far edge of the strip, partially covered by camouflage netting, partially lit by the faint bleed of the base's flood lamps. Even under the netting, even in the darkness, it had a presence. This was not a sleek aircraft. It was not designed to be beautiful. It was wide and heavy, and its nose was dominated by the barrel of the GAU-8 Avenger cannon in a way that left no ambiguity about what the machine had been built to do. Its wings were straight and broad and entirely functional. Its twin engines sat high on the fuselage like shoulders raised for a fight. It had been sitting here for weeks. Sand had scoured its paint. Its systems had gone cold. In another context, it might have looked abandoned. She slowed as she approached it. Not hesitation, something closer to the recognition you feel when you encounter something you know deeply after a long absence. She reached out and placed her hand flat against the fuselage. The metal was cool from the night air. Under her palm, she could feel the texture, the rivets, the panel seams, the slight roughness where the desert had been at work. She had grown up with this shape, had spent the best and worst hours of her life inside one. She took her hand away, reached up, grabbed the ladder. The climb was automatic. Her body remembered it the way bodies remember things that have been repeated enough times, not thought, not performed, just done. She was in the cockpit before the operators on the ground had fully registered the speed of it. Inside, it was close and dark, and it smelled of oil and heat and the staleness of a sealed space that has not been breathed in for a long time. She settled into the seat with her eyes already moving across the instrument panel, not reading it, anxiously surveying it the way a surgeon surveys a patient, looking for what she needed to know. Her hands began to move. She found the battery switch and held it. The panel flickered, dim, hesitant. The systems were cold. She tapped a gauge with her knuckle the way you tap something old that needs reminding it still has a purpose. Come on, she said quietly, to the aircraft, to herself, to nobody. Wake up! The HUD blinked, went dark, blinked again, and this time held. Outside, the operators watched the cockpit, watched the instrument lights shifting and stabilizing. Some of them had their arms crossed. Others were very still in the particular way of men who are trying not to want something too badly, because wanting something too badly is how you get hurt when it doesn't come. She reached for the throttle for the first engine, eased it forward. The turbine coughed, a sound like something large clearing its throat after a long sleep. Then it faltered, a terrible pause in which the silence of the desert rushed back around them, and then it caught. A low whine climbing into a steady roar that built and built until it was no longer a sound you heard, but a sound you felt in the sternum. One of the younger operators exhaled audibly. She was already reaching for the second engine. It came up cleaner than the first. The two sounds merged into a single voice, deep, purposeful, the voice of a machine that had been waiting and was now remembering what it was built for. The canopy came down with a hiss, sealing her inside. For a moment, Braddock could see her raise through the glass, still focused entirely at home, in a place that looked to everyone else like a complicated instrument panel in a cramped metal box. She reached for the headset. Her lips moved. Her voice came through the bass frequency. Calm. Even. The voice of someone who has done this before and intends to do it correctly. Control, this is Valkyrie. Systems coming online. Engines hot. Preparing to taxi. Nobody in the vicinity spoke. Braddock turned to find Hargrove standing beside him. He had not heard the commander approach. He said low enough that only Hargrove could hear. I was wrong about her. Hargrove watched the A-10 begin to move, wheels grinding against cracked asphalt, the roar deepening as the aircraft found its footing. So was I, he said. For about 30 seconds. The Warthog rolled down the strip. The floodlights threw its shadow long behind it. Around the base, in the doorways of outbuildings and along the perimeter wall, Figures had gathered staff mechanics, the wounded operators who had been told to rest and had not been able to, all of them watching this thing they had not expected to see. An aircraft they had written off. A pilot no one had considered. Moving together toward the end of the runway, she reached the end, turned, aligned. Inside the cockpit, she opened the lining of her jacket, touched the embroidered patch with 2 fingers. Just for a moment. Number 23, her father's number. She had touched it the same way before every mission she had ever flown, and this mission was no different from any other in that respect, and entirely different from all the others in every other respect. She closed the lining, her hands went back to the controls. The engine screamed. The Warthog surged forward, heavy and committed tires screaming against the asphalt, accelerating through the darkness with everything it had. At 100 knots, the nose began to lift. At 130, the wheels released the earth, and the desert dropped away beneath her, and the dark sky received the aircraft without ceremony, as dark skies do. The A-10 Thunderbolt climbed into the night and disappeared above the mountains. The men on the ground stood in the wake of its passing, in the settling dust, in the fading echo of engines that were already gone. And for the first time since the team had come through the gates broken and nearly finished the air at FOB Kestrel, felt different. Not safe, not saved, but possible. The night was long and it was far from over. But Valkyrie was in it now. The mountains at night are deceptive. From the ground they look solid and permanent and indifferent to everything happening at their feet. From the air they look different. From the air, especially low and fast, with a terrain-following system, painting the ridgelines green on your display, they look like something that is trying to catch you. Fly too high and you are visible to everything below. Fly too low and the mountain makes the decision for you. Sarah Mercer flew to the middle of that narrow margin the way she had always flown it, not with aggression, not with recklessness, but with the precision of someone who has done something long enough that the fear has been replaced by respect. She respected the terrain, she respected the aircraft, she respected the darkness. The A-10 climbed through the first range of peaks and leveled, and she used those first 2 minutes to do what she had always done in the early phase of every mission. She listened. Not to the radio, not yet, to the aircraft itself. The way the engine sounded, the way the controls responded, the slight tendencies and resistances that told you whether the machine was content or whether it was tolerating you under protest. Every aircraft had a character. This one had been sitting still for weeks, and like anything that has been still too long, it was stiff, but it was flying. That was what mattered. She keyed the radio. Valkyrie to hammer ground. I am airborne heading to your position. Confirm current status. Static, a pause that lasted long enough to tighten something in her chest. Then a voice came through, male-controlled, carrying the strain of a man who has been managing himself carefully for several hours and is doing it consciously. Valkyrie, this is Hammer 2 Actual. Good to hear you. We are at grid November, Kilo 74, pinned on 3 sides. Eastern approach is their primary push. 2 critical wounded ammunition, critical mortar incoming at irregular intervals. We needed you about an hour ago. She had the grid on her display before he finished speaking. Copy that, Hammer 2, on station in 90 seconds. Mark your position with smoke on my call. Standing by. She pushed the throttle forward, and the Warthog responded, not with the sharp surge of a fighter jet, but with something more deliberate, more committed. The mountains fell away beneath her. The valley opened ahead, dark and wide, and threaded with the small lights of tracer fire moving back and forth like an argument conducted in red and white. She had seen this before. Not this valley, not these men, but this moment, the aerial view of a fight that is going wrong, the pattern of fire that tells you which side is pressing and which side is holding by narrowing margins. She read it in seconds. The eastern approach was the problem. A concentrated mass moving through a channel where the terrain funneled everything together and made the defender's position nearly untenable. Behind the infantry pushed vehicles' heat signatures on her thermal display, irregular rectangles of orange and yellow against the cool ground. She had seen enough. Hammer 2 mark now. A red bloom appeared in the darkness below, small and vivid against the black terrain. Visual confirmed, she said. Stand by. She banked, aligned, came down low along the eastern ridgeline, with the valley floor rising to meet her, and her thumb finding the trigger with the certainty of muscle memory that runs deeper than thought. The GAU-8 Avenger spoke. There is no adequate description of that sound for someone who has never heard it in person. It is not a rattle or a burst or a bang. It is something below all of those words, a tearing, grinding roar that seems to come from everywhere simultaneously, so low and so massive that the body receives it as much as the ears do. Ground troops who have experienced it from the friendly side say that it does not sound like a weapon. It sounds like the Earth deciding to take a side. The eastern approach dissolved in a line of detonations. The vehicles caught first fuel igniting in sudden orange spheres that lit the valley walls in harsh relief. The infantry positions behind them, fragmented fighters scattering in every direction as the ground they had trusted became something they could no longer stand on. She pulled up hard, banked left, came around for assessment. Hammer 2 first pass complete. Eastern push disrupted. How are you reading a beat? Then the same voice and something in it had shifted. Not relief. These were not men who allowed themselves relief in the middle of a fight, but the beginning of a breath that had not been possible a minute ago. Valkyrie, that is significant. They are pulling back from the east. Give me your next available. Give me your secondary concerns in order of priority, she said. While he was talking, she was already threading the aircraft back through the ridgeline, repositioning her eyes, moving between the terrain display and the thermal feed with a rhythm that no longer required deliberate thought. The aircraft was warming up around her. The systems were becoming more cooperative. The Warthog was remembering itself. She was remembering herself. It was during the repositioning for the second pass that she heard it. She had asked each element of the pinned team for a position report, standard practice, building a complete picture before committing to the next attack axis. The replies came in sequence, clipped and professional. She logged each one, and then the last one came through. Hammer 2, this is Element 4. We are holding at the southern rock line. One man walking wounded, one man mobile. Suppression from the north is manageable for now. Request you prioritize the mortar team on the high ridge. They have our range and they are using it. She had already begun building the targeting solution for the mortar team. The voice was young, controlled, trying very hard to sound as though it had more margin than it did. She almost moved past it. Then something stopped her. It was not a rational process. It happened below the level of rational processes in some part of her older than training and older than combat. Something in the rhythm of that voice, the particular way the vowels sat, the way the final consonant of the word manageable was not quite fully pronounced, the speaker economizing on the ending, the way he always had when he was under pressure. She had noticed that habit when he was 15 years old doing homework at the kitchen table and pretending he wasn't struggling with it. She had heard that voice for 26 years. Not often enough, not nearly enough. In phone calls that were too short. In visits home that both of them had known were ending the moment they began. In the specific way he laughed at things that weren't funny, which was one of the better things about him, and the specific way he went quiet when he was frightened, which was what she was hearing right now underneath all the control. Element 4, Declan. She said nothing. Her hand tightened on the stick, not a tremor, a grip. The kind of grip that channels something through the only avenue available to it. He did not know she was here. She had not known he was here. His unit, his rotation, his assigned position, none of it had appeared in any briefing she had received in 3 weeks because operational security was what it was and the desert was large, and the specific coincidence that was currently happening was less impossible in practice than it seemed in theory. Her brother was in that valley. Her brother was on the ground with almost no ammunition with a mortar team that had established his range with an enemy force that had been pressing for hours, and he did not know that the aircraft overhead was being flown by the person who had taught him to throw a baseball in the backyard of their mother's house in Colorado when he was 7 years old. She keyed her radio with a voice she controlled absolutely. Element 4 copy. Mortar team on the high ridge is next. Give me 60 seconds. Copy Valkyrie, thank you. She turned the aircraft north. She did not think about Declan. She thought about the mortar team and the ridge geometry and the attack angle and the crosswind. She thought about nothing else. This was something she had learned a long time ago, not the absence of feeling, but its containment. You put it somewhere inside where it could wait, where it would not interfere with what needed to be done, where you could return to it when the mission gave you permission. She put it somewhere inside and she went after the mortar team. The ridge lit up beneath her cannon and went silent. 300 kilometers from the valley, in a position that appeared on no map, that the men of FOB Kestrel had access to, a man sat in a folding chair before a radio setup that had been assembled with professional precision and was being operated with professional attention. Colonel Gregor Vasek was 50 years old and had spent the better part of 30 of those years in various forms of armed conflict, first as a soldier, then as something more ambiguous and considerably more expensive. He was not a large man. He had the kind of unremarkable physical presence that was in his profession an advantage. People underestimated him until the moment they stopped being in a position to have opinions about him. He had planned this operation for 6 weeks. The American team, their route, their timing, their support structure. He had reliable information on all of it, and the information had proved accurate in every detail. The ambush had executed precisely as designed. The team had been driven back, depleted, cornered. What remained was time and pressure. Then his communications officer placed a careful hand on his arm. "Sir," the man said, "we are monitoring the American air frequency. There is an aircraft airborne from Kestrel." Vasek had built this operation on the foundational assumption that Kestrel had no viable air assets. An aircraft changed every calculation on the table. He picked up the secondary radio himself and listened. He heard a voice. Female. Calm, with the specific calm of someone who has been in this situation before and is working through it methodically. He heard a call sign. He set the radio down very carefully and looked at nothing for a moment. He had heard that call sign before. Not in person, through the aftermath of things that had gone wrong in ways they should not have. An operation 3 years ago in which an A-10 had appeared from nowhere and destroyed his entire resupply column. 40 men, 12 vehicles. 3 months of materiel, gone in under 4 minutes. The investigation had eventually concluded that the pilot had been acting outside authorized parameters. He had always assumed that the pilot had been dealt with permanently. He had assumed incorrectly. "SAM teams," he said to his communications officer in the quiet voice he used when the matter was not open to discussion. "Both of them, mobile. Position them on the ridge lines flanking the valley approach." He paused for precisely 2 seconds. "This one is not to escape." "Yes, sir." Vasek picked up the radio again, listened to her voice, and waited with the patience of a man who has built his entire professional life around the principle that patience applied correctly defeats almost everything. She came around for the 4th pass, and the world changed. The alarm was not a sound so much as a physical event, a tone that cut through every other sensory input and registered in the body as pure threat information. Her eyes went immediately to the display. 2 SAM launches, shoulder-mounted portable systems by the trajectory signatures. Mobile launchers, not fixed emplacements. Someone had moved them into position while she was making her runs, had waited for the moment when she would be committed to an attack line with limited options. Someone had been thinking about her patterns. Someone had anticipated her. She broke left and pushed the nose down simultaneously, trading altitude for speed and options, and her hand found the flare dispensers without looking. The aircraft shuddered as the countermeasures fired bright blooms of heat and light, scattering behind her into the darkness. The first missile chased the flares. Gone. She was already banking right, pulling hard, the G-forces compressing her vision at the edges and pressing her deep into the seat. The second missile had not been fooled by the initial flare burst. She could see it on the threat display, still tracking, closing the angle, making the small, continuous corrections that a smart munition makes when it wants to be certain. She dispensed a second burst and rolled inverted, and for 2 full seconds she was upside down over the valley with the stars below her and the burning ground above, and the missile coming from behind. Then it veered. Not cleanly, the proximity was close enough that the detonation rattled the airframe with a sharp concussive report she felt in her jaw and her spine simultaneously. Something struck the right wing. She rolled upright and checked her displays with the focused speed of someone assessing damage while continuing to remain alive. Right wing structural integrity holding. Control response, she tested it, reduced but functional. The aircraft was still hers. She climbed and put distance between herself and the valley for 30 seconds of relative safety. "Control, this is Valkyrie." Her voice was even. "Someone deployed mobile SAM teams into the ridgelines while I was on my attack runs. This is not improvised response. Someone anticipated this operation." Hargrove's voice came back immediately. "We know. Are you still flyable?" "I am. Right wing took fragment damage. Manageable." A pause. "Tell me what you know, Commander." A silence longer than she wanted, then Hargrove, and something in his voice that she had not heard in it before, a controlled anger, working hard to stay beneath the surface. "We received intelligence 14 minutes ago from a higher command relay. The mission package. The teams wrote, the timeline, the support profile was compromised before they ever left the wire. The ambush was not an encounter, it was a reception. Someone provided operational details to the opposing force before the mission began." She processed this. "Which means they knew the team would be in that valley, and they knew Kestrel had no air support." "Until tonight," Hargrove said. "Until tonight. And now they have repositioned SAM teams specifically because of tonight, which means they have someone monitoring our frequencies or our movements in real time." She thought about the patience of whoever had positioned those launchers, the anticipation of her run patterns. "This is being directed. One person is directing this. That is our assessment as well." She thought about Declan in the valley. She thought about the mortar teams she had just eliminated, and the SAM teams that were still operational, and the coordinated force that had been waiting for these men before the mission ever began. Does the team in the valley know about the compromise? Negative, I need them focused on moving. Agreed. She turned the aircraft back toward the mountains. I'm going back in. Valkyrie, I'm going back in, Commander. The SAM teams know my position now, which means they have one too. And a position is a target. She pushed the throttle. Have your team ready to move when I open that northern corridor. I'm going to open it, and I cannot tell you how long it will stay open. A pause, then copy that. We'll be ready. She turned the aircraft north and descended back into the fight. Then the cannon stopped. It was not explosive or catastrophic. There was no drama in the mechanical fact of it. She pressed the trigger on a run against a reinforced position that had been hammering Hammer 2's left flank, and instead of the roar, there was a brief grinding sound, and then silence where the roar should have been. She pulled off the run and checked the weapons display. Cannon jammed. The indicator was flat and red, and entirely unambiguous about what it meant. She had been flying combat aircraft long enough to know that this was not necessarily fatal, and also long enough to know that it was very serious. The A-10's primary weapon, the reason the aircraft existed, was offline. What she retained was her remaining rocket pods and the bombs on her wing stations. Not nothing, but less precise and requiring closer, slower attack runs, which meant more exposure to the SAM teams that were still operational and still patient somewhere in those ridgelines. She clicked to the maintenance frequency. Kestrel maintenance, this is Valkyrie, cannon jam, GAU-8, not firing. I need a diagnostic, over. A pause, then a voice she had not heard before, male, older, with the measured cadence of a man who has worked on these systems for many years and has learned not to panic about them. Copy, Valkyrie. Give me the jam indicator code from your panel. She read him the code. Okay, he said. Feed tray obstruction. Happens when the system has been cold for an extended period and the belt tension is off. The clearing procedure is not simple. I am going to walk you through it while you are flying. Start walking, she said. What followed was 4 minutes of dialogue between a pilot simultaneously maneuvering an aircraft through a hostile valley and executing a multi-step diagnostic procedure, and a mechanic reading from a maintenance manual in a building 40 kilometers from the fight, translating technical instructions into something executable in real time. His name was Sergeant First Class Arthur Dole, and he had maintained A-10s for 19 years, and he would carry to the end of his life the knowledge of what those 4 minutes meant, without ever fully being able to explain it to anyone who wasn't there. During those 4 minutes, she used rockets and bombs to maintain pressure on the valley. Less precise, more dangerous, requiring attack profiles that kept her lower and slower than the SAM threat wanted her to be. She used the terrain as cover between runs, threading through the ridgelines, never flying the same angle twice. The SAM teams fired once during this interval. She was already out of the envelope. Someone out there was very good at this. She was better. It was on the 3rd minute of the clearing procedure between Dole's instruction about the secondary feed release and his instruction about the belt tension reset that the radio brought something from the valley that stopped her breath for a single controlled moment. Declan's voice. Element 4. Reporting renewed contact on the southern rock line, more fighters pressing from a new angle. And then, we have a man down, Keller, leg wound critical. He cannot move without assistance. She confirmed receipt without inflection and continued the clearing procedure. But she was thinking about 2 heat signatures on a thermal display. One stationary, one hovering, close beside it, not moving away. She was thinking about what it meant to stay beside someone when the tactical logic of the situation said that moving would be smarter. She was thinking about 26 years of knowing exactly what kind of person would make that choice. She finished Dole's procedure. Her thumb went to the trigger. The Avenger fired. The sound of it coming back to life, that deep, grinding, purposeful roar rolling through the airframe, was one of the finest sounds she had ever heard in her life. She did not take time to appreciate it. Cannon is live, she told Dole. Outstanding, he said, with the satisfaction of a man who has fixed something that very much needed fixing. She's all yours. She clicked back to the tactical frequency without ceremony. Hammer 2, this is Valkyrie, switching to close support on the southern rock line. Tell Element 4 to get their heads down and keep them there. Copy, Valkyrie. Wait 1. A brief pause. Element 4 confirms. They are ready. She came in low, lower than she had come all night. The thermal display showed the fighters pressing from the new angle, a cluster of heat signatures, moving with the confidence of people who believed they had sufficient cover. They did not have sufficient cover. She aligned and fired, and the southern approach went quiet in the specific way that things go quiet when the cannon has spoken about them. She pulled up and came around, and it was in the moment of climbing the aircraft rising, the terrain falling away, the brief pause between runs, that she let herself feel for the length of one complete exhale what she had been containing since the moment she recognized her brother's voice. She reached into the lining of her jacket. The patch was small, and the embroidery was soft with age. Number 23. Her father's hands had worn this same fabric against his own chest. He had flown these same approaches, not this valley, not these mountains, but the same mathematics of low and fast, and committed the same understanding of what it meant to be overhead when the men below were out of options. He had died doing exactly this. She pressed the patch between two fingers for the count of 3 breaths. Then she put her hand back on the stick. Her father was not here tonight, but she was. She was here, and the cannon was live, and her brother was on the ground, and there was more work to do. That was enough. The second SAM attack came when she was climbing out of a run on a vehicle that had been repositioned to cover the northern corridor. She had known it was coming. The timing was logical. Wait until the pilot has committed her ordnance and is climbing out of a run with limited defensive options, then fire. It was what she would have done. She had been watching the threat display for exactly this moment. 2 launch indications appeared simultaneously. Not one this time, both SAM teams. Together, she understood immediately. They had been watching her run patterns all night. They had identified the geometry of her exit from an attack, the direction she climbed, the altitude. She sought the predictable window of exposure. They had waited for exactly this configuration. Whoever was directing this was patient and methodical and very good. She dispensed flares and broke hard right and drove the nose toward the terrain, which was the opposite of where instinct wanted her to go. Instinct said altitude, said space, said options. Experience said that altitude in this moment was a geometry problem that ended badly, and that the terrain navigated correctly provided cover that no amount of sky could offer. She threaded the aircraft between 2 ridge lines at a speed and altitude that left no margin for error. The valley walls moved past the canopy at a rate she refused to calculate because the calculation would not help her. What would help her was the next control input, and the one after that executed correctly and without hesitation. She made them. The first missile chased the flares and detonated in the hills behind her. The second was smarter. It adjusted to her brake and came back. She saw it adjusting on the display. She dispensed her last salvo of flares and executed a barrel roll at an altitude that would have made her instructor in the simulator close his eyes, and the missile proximity detonated 40 meters off her left wing with a concussive report that she felt in her teeth and her ribcage. The left engine flamed out. Not explosively, not catastrophically. It simply stopped a clean cessation of the low vibration she had been feeling through the left side of the airframe all night, replaced by sudden asymmetry that the aircraft and her body registered in the same instant. The aircraft yawed left. She corrected. The right engine was still running. A single-engine A-10 was flyable. She had practiced this in simulation and in controlled conditions, and she had never practiced it at night with structural damage to 2 wing sections in a valley full of men who needed her to not fall out of the sky. She flew it anyway. Control, this is Valkyrie. Her voice was exactly as calm as it always was. Left engine is out from a proximity detonation. Right engine nominal. I am single engine, still flyable, continuing overwatch. A silence that lasted 2 seconds. Valkyrie, Hargrove said, honest assessment. My honest assessment is that your team is in a valley right now, and they need me overhead until they reach the extraction point. I can give them that. After that, we can discuss the aircraft. A breath on the other end. Then, what do you need from me? Have the extraction helicopter ready to lift the moment the last man is aboard. I am working a narrow margin up here, and I would prefer not to orbit longer than necessary. Understood. Done. She turned the aircraft north and went back to work. The Warthog rattled. The right engine held. She held. The night was not finished with them yet, but it was running out of things to throw. The northern corridor was a problem with a specific geometry. She had been studying it on her terrain display for the better part of an hour between runs and SAM evasions, and the steady accumulation of damage that the Warthog was absorbing without surrendering. The corridor was a channel between 2 ridgelines, approximately 400 meters wide at its narrowest point, opening into flatter ground beyond, that led eventually to the extraction zone. On paper, it was a viable route out. In practice, it was being held closed by a reinforced blocking position at the northern end, 2 machine gun nests on the eastern ridgeline that she had damaged but not eliminated, and whatever Vasic had repositioned since she had disrupted his original arrangement. She climbed to an altitude that gave her visibility across the whole engagement area and took 30 seconds to build a complete picture. This was something her first instructor had taught her. A good pilot never attacks without a plan, and a bad pilot attacks the same way twice. She had internalized both halves of that teaching deeply enough that they were no longer instructions but instinct. She keyed the radio. Hammer 2. This is Valkyrie. Current status. How long can you hold? Webb's voice came back without delay. He had the quality she valued most in a ground commander. He did not soften what was true. Valkyrie, we are at the edge of what we have. 2 critical wounded who need surgery inside of 2 hours. Ammunition nearly gone across all elements. We can hold maybe 20 minutes before the numbers stop working for us. 20 minutes, she said, give or take. She looked at the northern corridor on her display, the blocking position, the machine gun nests, her weapons inventory, what remained, what it would cost, what margin it left her. The single-engine limitation on her maneuvering options. I'm going to open it, she said. When I call clear, you move everything north through that corridor, and you do not stop for any reason. If someone goes down, 2 people bring them. You keep the formation together, and you do not stop. Do you understand me? Copy, we will be ready. One more thing. She paused. Element 4. I need them second from the front, not point, not rear, second from front. A brief silence, the silence of a ground commander who suspects there is a reason for a pilot specifying infantry positioning and has enough operational respect to leave the reason alone. Copy. Second from front. Good. Move on my call. The first element of the plan was the machine gun nests on the eastern ridgeline. She came at them from an angle the terrain partially masked, not invisible but less exposed than a direct approach, using the shape of the land the way a careful person uses available cover. She identified the first nest by its muzzle flash bright and regular against the darkness of the ridge. She put her reticle on it and fired a short burst. The muzzle flash stopped. The second nest swung toward her as she pulled off. She felt the rounds, not felt them the way you feel something that touches you, but felt them the way you feel weather approaching a disturbance in the air around the aircraft that had her coordinates on it and missed its address by a margin that was acceptable and not comfortable. She broke off, came around in a tight arc, returned from the opposite angle lower and with more certainty. When she fired the second time, the nest came apart and the ridgeline went quiet. She noted the last known positions of the SAM teams. Still quiet. Still somewhere in the terrain. She treated silence from a threat as repositioning, not elimination. Now the blocking position. She climbed slightly to achieve the attack angle the geometry required. It meant approaching from the northwest, which exposed her right side to the ridgeline, where she believed one of the SAM teams had last positioned. There were moments in every mission where the correct decision was also the dangerous one. She had never allowed the danger to make the decision for her. She aligned. She let herself think briefly and without permission about her father. Not about him dying, she had done that thinking a long time ago, and it was finished. About him flying. About him making this same type of calculation in some other dark place over some other terrain, choosing the correct angle because it was correct regardless of what the correct angle cost. She thought about the fact that she had never been able to ask him whether he was frightened in those moments or whether the fear had been replaced, as it had been for her, by something that felt less like courage and more like simple clarity about what the moment required. She thought that she knew the answer, that she had always known it. The blocking position filled her targeting reticle. She fired everything she had reserved for this moment. The cannon roared and the last of her bombs came off the wings, a convergence of ordnance, arriving at the northern end of the corridor in a sequence of detonations that built on each other, the blast waves overlapping the secondary explosions from stored ammunition and fuel, adding their voices to the sum. She pulled hard over the top of it and felt the heat through the canopy and heard debris strike the underside of the aircraft and continued flying. She came around and looked at what remained. The blocking position was gone. Not suppressed, gone. In its place was a burning scar in the terrain, absolute and decisive, a statement rendered in fire and depleted uranium, that the northern corridor was open, and the decision about contesting it had been made on behalf of everyone who might have been considering the option. She keyed the radio. Hammer 2, this is Valkyrie. Corridor is clear. Move now, do not wait. Move now. Webb's voice and the control in it was almost, not quite, but almost insufficient to contain what was underneath. Copy, Valkyrie, we are moving. She could hear it begin through the open frequency, the sounds of a formation that has been told it has exactly one chance and is taking it with everything it has left. The SAM team that had gone quiet chose this moment. They had been watching her run patterns. They had identified the predictable geometry of her exit from an attack, the direction she climbed, the altitude she sought. They had waited for exactly this configuration. It was, she acknowledged without resentment, the correct tactic. Both launch indications appeared simultaneously. She dispensed flares and rolled left and drove the nose toward the terrain, the valley walls moving past at a rate she refused to calculate. She threaded between two ridgelines. The first missile chased the flares. The second adjusted. She had no flares left. She executed the barrel roll, the same maneuver she had used once before tonight, at an altitude that made it very dangerous, at a speed that made it more dangerous still. The missile proximity detonated. Not a direct hit. The concussive report cracked through the airframe, and something that had been holding on the right wing let go with a sound she felt rather than heard. She flew straight and took inventory. Right engine running hot but nominal. Left engine still out. Right aileron significantly degraded. The aircraft wanted to roll right and required continuous left input to stay straight. She gave it. Fuel acceptable for another 20 minutes of flight. Hull pressurization holding. She was still flying. The corridor below her was moving. On the thermal display, she could see the formation, 12 heat signatures irregular in their spacing because of the wounded pushing north through the gap she had carved. She tracked them. She watched the terrain on both sides of the corridor for anything attempting to close it. 3 times she identified threats forming on the margins. Fighters attempting to organize a pursuit. 3 times she rolled in and addressed them with what remained of her cannon ammunition, measuring every burst, now making each one count for more than it should have had to count for alone. The Warthog rattled continuously. The right engine held. She held. The formation moved through the corridor. She counted the heat signatures. She counted them again. All 12 were moving. All 12 were in the corridor. All 12 were heading north. Declan Mercer did not look up. He had been told to keep his head down, and he was doing it, and he was also half-carrying Sergeant Aaron Keller, whose left leg had been rearranged by a fragment into something that required creative interpretation to still be called a leg, and the combination of discipline and the weight of another person kept his attention entirely at ground level. But he could hear it. He had been hearing it all night. The Warthog's engine, even reduced now to one, had a sound that could not be lost track of. It moved in and out of range as she made her runs, but it was always there in the background, a presence that was also a commitment. Every time the cannon had spoken, that specific, unmistakable roar, something that had been pressing on his chest, had released slightly, enough to breathe, enough to keep moving. He did not know that it was Sarah. How could he have known? She had been suspended from flight status for 8 months. The last time he had seen her had been 14 months ago, a brief visit home that both of them had known was going to be brief and had spent the entire length of pretending wasn't already ending. She had seemed tired in a way she was not willing to discuss. He had not pressed. They had both been raised to respect certain boundaries in each other, and pressing would have cost them the time they had. He had his own deployment. She had her silence. They both carried what they carried, as the Mercers had always done. Keller made a sound, not a word, something between a question and a statement of pain, and Declan tightened his grip and said, "I've got you," without thinking about it, because it was what you said and because it was true. The cannon fired overhead, close. The threat on the eastern margin of the corridor evaporated. "Keep moving," Webb said from ahead of him. They kept moving. She could see the extraction zone on her display. Approximately 3 kilometers beyond the northern end of the corridor, flat open ground, identified in the mission planning as a viable helicopter landing zone. The formation was moving well. Better than she had expected, given what she had observed on the thermal display throughout the night. Webb was holding them together with whatever combination of discipline and will had gotten him this far, and the operators were doing what operators do in the final phase of something very hard. They were deciding to make it, and that decision was carrying them. She continued orbiting, continued watching. The SAM teams had not fired since the last exchange. Vasek's force was not mounting a coherent pursuit. She had disrupted enough often enough that the disorganization was now structural. A well-led force could recover from individual disruptions. It had more difficulty recovering when the disruptions compounded over hours, and the communications were degraded, and the leadership was making decisions from information that was 3 engagements out of date. She had disrupted them enough times. She watched the formation emerge from the northern end of the corridor into the open ground beyond. The heat signatures spread slightly as the operators adjusted to the wider terrain, the formation breathing with the relief of people who have come through a narrow place. Nothing moved in the terrain around them. Hammer 2. You are clear of the corridor. Extraction zone is 3 kilometers northeast. I have you on display. No threats visible on your flanks. Webb's voice in something human had broken through the operational surface of it now. Not unprofessional, these were not unprofessional men, but audible. The sound of a man who has been managing himself carefully for a very long time and is allowing the management to ease by careful degrees. Copy Valkyrie, 3 kilometers. We see the zone. I will be overhead until you are aboard. Keep moving. We are moving. She climbed slightly to conserve the right engine's power. The aircraft wanted to descend on a single engine, impartial fuel, the physics of its condition expressing themselves in a constant pressure on the controls that she was correcting continuously, and without letting it become anything more than a technical consideration. She had been correcting it for 20 minutes. She could correct it for 20 more. The right engine's temperature gauge was reading higher than she wanted. She noted it and did not look at it again, because looking at it would not change it. The extraction helicopter appeared on her display 8 minutes later, coming in low and fast from the northwest on the correct approach for terrain masking. She had been in radio contact with the crew for 10 minutes, coordinating timing, confirming LZ status, describing the threat environment with the precision that helicopter crews need when committing to a landing in a location where people have been shooting things at other people. The crew came in the way professionals come into a hot landing zone, committed fast in the geometry that minimized exposure. She watched them settle into the LZ, and she orbited above and covered the approach, making one final pass across the surrounding terrain in the last minutes before the formation arrived. Nothing moved. The helicopter settled, and she watched the formation reach the perimeter and begin loading. The heat signatures, each one a human being who had spent the night in a valley that had tried to keep them moved toward the aircraft and disappeared inside it one by one. She counted. When she reached 11, she kept counting, and the 12th signature moved to the aircraft and was aboard. Webb's voice came through from inside the helicopter, the rotor noise present behind it, now the sound of a man accounting for the lives he had been responsible for. Valkyrie, we have 12 personnel aboard. Reading you the full manifest for confirmation. A pause. The sound of a list being accessed. Names read in the clipped cadence of a man making certain. 8 names she did not know. Then Keller Aaron J. Then 2 more. Then Mercer Declan J. walking wounded stable. She said nothing. Her jaw was tight. In the command room at FOB Kestrel, Hargrove was listening to the same frequency. He had been listening for the past hour. He heard the name read and something stopped in him, not dramatically, without any outward sign. He reached across the table and picked up Sarah's personnel file, which had been open in front of him since Braddock had first pulled it hours earlier. He looked at the top line, Sarah Ellen Mercer, Captain USAF. He looked at the name Webb had just read from the manifest, Mercer Declan J. He set the file down very carefully. Braddock was watching him from across the table. Sir Hargrove was quiet for a moment. He looked at the radio. He looked at the dark runway beyond the window where the Warthog would eventually return. She knew, he said quietly. The whole time up there, she knew he was in that valley. Braddock absorbed this slowly. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at the commander. And she never said anything. No, Hargrove said. She didn't. The secondary communications channel broke open at that moment. A relay from the higher command post, automated, formal, carrying the bureaucratic tone of something composed by someone sitting far from everything that had happened tonight. Braddock took the handset. Read it once. Read it again. He passed it to Hargrove without comment. It was a restoration of flight status. Captain Sarah Ellen Mercer, USAF. Effective immediately. Signed by a 2-star who had been monitoring the operation through the night and had found at the conclusion of it that certain paperwork could not responsibly wait until morning. Attached to the restoration as regulations required was a summary of the original suspension. Hargrove read it. He read the reason carefully. A civilian convoy, an unauthorized engagement in support of non-combatants, 34 lives preserved. The specific, careful language of a document that had been written to punish someone for doing something right without ever quite using those words. He read it once. He did not read it again. Suspended for saving 34 people, Braddock said. His voice was flat. Not surprised he had been in the military too long for this particular category of thing to surprise him. The flatness of a man who has seen the distance between what is right and what is official, navigated by people who do not have to stand in it. Restored for saving 12, Hargrove said. Braddock looked at the document, then at the window. What does that tell you? Hargrove folded the document and placed it in his jacket pocket. It tells me that tonight the right people were paying attention, he paused. For once, he stood. Get to the flight line. She heard Webb's final confirmation through her headset. 12 aboard, all personnel accounted for. Clear for extraction, 12. The number arrived in her chest with a weight and a quality she had not anticipated and could not have prepared for. She had known the number was 12. She had been working towards 12 all night, run by run, threat by threat, through the mechanical failure in the SAM evasions, in the single engine, and everything else the night had assembled against her. She had known the number abstractly. Hearing it confirmed all 12, no one left in the valley. The mathematics of survival resolving finally and completely in the correct direction was something different from knowing it abstractly, something older than knowledge. Copy that, Hammer 2, she said. You are complete. Get clear of the valley and climb to extraction altitude. Copy, Valkyrie. Webb's voice and the operational surface of it had dropped away entirely now. He was not performing control anymore because control was no longer the priority. He sounded like a man who has just survived something significant and is allowing himself to know it. God bless you. She watched the helicopter lift from the LZ on her display, watched it bank northwest and begin putting the ridge lines behind it, climbing away from the valley and into the open desert where the remaining SAM threat was no longer irrelevant geometry. She stayed between the helicopter and the terrain until it was clear of the mountains. Then she turned southwest toward FOB Kestrel. The right engine's temperature was still climbing. She watched it and she flew. The runway lights of Kestrel appeared in the darkness 32 minutes later. She had been in contact with the tower throughout the approach, reporting the single engine status and the wing damage and the temperature issue, and the tower had responded with the calm efficiency of people who are very good at managing situations that are close to going wrong. The crash crew was positioned. The medical team was standing by. Hargrove was outside on the flight line. She flew the approach with the right engine running hot and the right aileron not entirely responsive in the aircraft's preference to roll right that she was managing with continuous left rudder input. She flew it correctly because that was the only acceptable way to fly it, and because there were people on the ground who had survived the night and deserved to watch the aircraft land rather than not land. The wheels touched with a firmness that was outside the comfort range and inside the survivable range. She felt the aircraft settle and she let it settle, and she brought the throttle back, and the speed bled away along the runway, and the Warthog rolled to a stop with the right engine still running hot, and the continuous rattle finally silenced by the absence of flight. She sat for a moment with her hands on her knees. Her body required some quantity of stillness before it was willing to begin the next thing, and she gave it what it required without argument. She was 35 years old, and she had just flown the most consequential night of her career on one engine, with a damaged wing in an aircraft that had been sitting in the desert for weeks, and every person who had entered that valley was going home. She ran through the shutdown checklist from memory, as she always did, because discipline does not stop at the threshold of exhaustion. The right engine spooled down. The avionics powered off in sequence. The HUD went dark. The aircraft went quiet. She opened the canopy. The desert air came in cool and vast and carrying the smell of a night that had been burning and had begun to settle. Above her, the sky was the deep blue of the last hour before dawn. The stars were still visible in the west. In the east, the faintest suggestion of something that was not yet light but was preparing to be. She climbed down the ladder. Her boots touched the ground. She stood. They were waiting for her, not arranged, simply present. The people of FOB Kestrel, who had found their way to the flight line during the hours since she had lifted, drawn by the sound and the radio reports, in the specific gravity that a significant event creates around itself, whether or not anyone organizes it. Mechanics and communications staff and support personnel, and the operators who had remained at the base through the night, who had spent it on the radios and the perimeter walls, and who had listened to every transmission. Braddock was among them. She walked toward the group, and nobody spoke. This was not the silence of people who did not know what to say. It was a different kind of silence, the kind that acknowledges something without reducing it to language, that understands language would be smaller than the thing being acknowledged, and chooses honesty over the attempt. She had experienced this silence once before at her father's memorial, when a long line of men in dress uniforms had come to her family, and some of them had not spoken because they knew that speaking was the lesser tribute. Hargrove came forward. He stopped in front of her, close enough that what passed between them was between them. He looked at her with the expression she had been reading all night, hard on the surface, carrying something beneath it that the surface was not entirely containing. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he raised his hand to the brim of his cover. The salute was crisp and deliberate, and absolutely without ambiguity, about what it meant and why it was being offered. She returned it crisp, equal, unhurried. The exchange lasted 2 seconds and contained more than 2 hours of conversation would have managed. He lowered his hand. She lowered hers. Walt Braddock stepped forward. He was not a man who moved tentatively, but there was something careful in his approach, the carefulness of someone who is aware they owe a debt and is not certain the currency they have is adequate to pay it. He stopped in front of her and looked at her with the direct honesty she had observed in him from across the command room hours earlier and had correctly identified as genuine. "I was wrong about you," he said. Not an apology, more precise than an apology. An accounting, a man presenting the ledger accurately. She looked at him. "You were doing your job. You needed a sufficient basis before you committed to a position." He held her gaze. "That's a generous reading of what I did. It's an accurate one." She paused. "You would have done the same thing I did when the time came. That's why you trusted me eventually. You recognized it." He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded once, the deliberate nod of a man who has been told something he knows is true and has no counter to offer because none exists. He stepped back. She heard the helicopter before she saw it, the rotors carrying across the desert in the pre-dawn stillness, the sound growing from suggestion into arriving presence. She turned east and watched it come in its lights, blinking against the sky, settling toward the landing zone on the east side of the base. She walked toward it. She watched them come out. First, the ambulatory operators, some leaning on each other with the functional intimacy of men who have been very close to death together and have come through it and are done performing anything. Then the litter cases, Keller going first, his leg immobilized, his face gray, but his eyes tracking and present. Then the others, one by one. And then Webb climbing out last as ground commanders do, scanning once in each direction out of habit before allowing himself to be simply a person standing in the desert in the early morning. He saw her and gave her one nod that carried everything he had been unable to say on the radio. And then Declan. He was moving under his own power. She had not been certain he would be. His left hand was on the shoulder of the man ahead of him in the formation, not for support, but for the contact, the combat habit of maintaining physical connection with the people around you when everything else is uncertain. His face was covered in the residue of the night dust and soot and the gray quality of a body that has been running on emergency reserves for hours and knows the bill is coming. He had not seen her yet. She stood at the edge of the landing zone and watched him walk toward her and did not move to meet him because she was not certain of her own steadiness at this particular moment and because she wanted to watch him arrive, wanted to see him walking, wanted to have that image completely before anything else happened. He looked up. He saw her. The expression that crossed his face was not one she could have described afterward when people asked. It was too many things at once, disbelief and recognition, and the specific confusion of an exhausted mind encountering something it cannot immediately fit into the framework of what it believed to be true. His face worked through several things in a rapid succession and then became very still. He walked toward her. She moved to meet him. He was 26 years old, and he had been in a valley all night with people trying to kill him, and he had not broken, which she had never doubted for a moment. He was standing in front of her now in the blue pre-dawn dark, and neither of them had any words for it. Some things arrive before language does. She put her hand on his shoulder. He put his head down. Not crying, not quite. The thing that happens when you have been holding yourself together under sustained pressure, and you encounter something that makes holding together no longer strictly necessary. That thing, whatever it is properly called. She had felt it herself in the cockpit in the 30 seconds after Webb confirmed 12 aboard. She reached into the lining of her jacket. The patch was small and the embroidery was soft with age. Number 23, her father's squadron number. She had carried it for 26 years, longer than Declan's entire conscious life. He had been born the year their father did not come home. He had grown up with a photograph on the mantle, a folded flag in a cedar box, and the second-hand stories that she and their mother had passed to him carefully, because stories were all they had left to give. He knew who James Mercer had been. He knew what the man had stood for and what he had died doing. He simply had never known him in the way that you know someone who is present. She took the patch out. She pressed it into his hand and closed his fingers around it. He looked down at it in his palm. She watched him understand what it was. Then she watched him understand something more than what it was, the weight of what she had been carrying and how long she had been carrying it, and what it meant that she was giving it to him here now, on this specific morning after this specific night. "You flew for him," he said. His voice was very quiet. "I fly for him every time," she said. "But tonight," she stopped, began again. "Tonight it was for you." He looked at the patch for a long moment. Then he closed his fingers around it completely, the way you close your hand around something you intend to keep. I'll keep it, he said. I know you will. They stood together in the blue pre-dawn dark, while around them the base slowly resumed itself. People moving back to their stations, mechanics beginning to gather their tools, the ordinary business of a place picking up the thread of its ordinary business after something extraordinary had interrupted it. Hargrove found Braddock at the edge of the flight line as the first actual light was arriving. Not dawn yet, but the suggestion of it, the sky in the east beginning to separate from the mountains in a way that was unmistakably the beginning of day. Both of them were looking at the Warthog on the runway behind them. In the growing light, the damage was becoming fully visible. The right wing, the missing left engine. The fragment strikes across the fuselage that told the story of every near miss the aircraft had absorbed and declined to be stopped by. A maintenance crew had already gathered around it, moving slowly, touching panels carefully, the way you handle something that has been somewhere it shouldn't have been able to go and come back. She never said anything, Braddock said, about him being down there. She just flew. Yes. She knew the whole time. Yes. The light was growing. In the east, the sky had moved from dark blue to something lighter, something that had warmth beginning in it. 22 years, Braddock said. One rule, judge the person in front of you on what you see, not on what you expect to see. He was quiet for a moment. I broke my own rule last night. You were doing your duty, Hargrove said. The same thing Sarah had told Braddock 2 hours earlier, and Hargrove knew that and did not mention it. Braddock turned to look at the Warthog again. At the damage the morning was making fully honest. At the machine that had been asked to do more than it had remaining, and had done it because the person flying it would not accept the alternative. She's one of us now, he said. Not a question, not a vote or a designation being conferred. Simply a fact stated in the tone of a man who has very specific criteria for that phrase, and has never applied it carelessly and is certain without any qualification that every one of those criteria has been met by the events of this night. Hargrove said nothing. He did not need to. They stood together in the growing light while the sun finished its approach and cleared the ridgeline to the east, and the desert received it the way deserts receive everything, without ceremony, without comment, the light falling on everything equally. On the damaged aircraft and the tired men, and the woman standing at the far edge of the runway, looking east at the mountains that were finally in the light, just mountains. Sarah Mercer stood at the edge of the runway and looked at the sky. The valley was invisible from here, hidden by the ridgelines she had threaded through in the dark, the terrain that had tried to claim the aircraft on 3 separate occasions and had failed on all 3. The valley was beyond the mountains, and the mountains were just mountains now in the growing daylight. Which was one of the things daylight reliably did. It made things that had seemed impossible the night before look like geography. She thought about Vasek. She did not know his name, but she knew the shape of his thinking patient, methodical, willing to wait for the correct angle. She had been the correct angle for 12 men who were alive this morning. She wondered if that would be enough to reach him wherever he was. She thought probably it would not permanently. Men like that rebuilt and regrouped and reappeared. She thought that this was the nature of the work, not single acts of resolution, but the sustained refusal to be resolved in the wrong direction. She had refused it tonight. She would refuse it as many times as the work required. She put it away. The patch was with Declan. She felt the absence of it, the unfamiliar lightness in the lining of her jacket where it had been. But the lightness was not emptiness. It was something more precise than emptiness. A release, the sensation of putting down something you have carried for the right reasons for a very long time and have now passed forward for equally right reasons. The weight had moved. That was appropriate. Declan would carry it differently than she had. That was appropriate too. Her father had flown these approaches, had made these calculations over different terrain and different dark, had understood with his same completeness that she understood what it meant to be overhead when the men below had run out of everything else. He had died doing it at 31 years old in a place called Kosovo, leaving behind a 9-year-old daughter and an infant son and a wife who would spend the next 2 decades explaining to both children with whatever words she could find what their father had been. Sarah was 35 now. She had outlived him by 4 years of flight time. She intended to outlive him by considerably more. She was 35 years old and she had not flown in 8 months, and she had just flown the longest and most consequential night of her career on a single engine with structural damage and a weapon system that had failed mid-mission and had been repaired from 40 kilometers away over a radio by a man reading from a maintenance manual, and every person who had entered that valley was going home. The sun cleared the ridgeline. The light hit the desert and the runway and the warthog and the people moving around it with the complete democracy that light exercises, illuminating everything exactly as it is, without flattery and without mercy. The damaged wing, the missing engine, the fragment strikes across the fuselage, each one a record of a moment that had almost gone differently and had not. She looked at the aircraft for a long time, then she looked east at the mountains. Then she looked at the sky, which was enormous and clear, and the specific shade of blue that only exists in the first full minutes of desert morning, a color that has no adequate name in English, and that she had seen from cockpits all her life and had never grown used to. Behind her, she could hear the base resuming its ordinary operations. Mechanics beginning their work on the Warthog with the careful hands of people who respected what the machine had done. The medical team moving with the brisk purposefulness of people who have patients to attend to. Somewhere on the east side of the base, Declan was sitting with Keller doing what you do for a person in pain when you cannot yet do more, staying present, which is never nothing. She did not look for anyone to tell her she had done enough. She already knew. The morning held the desert, and the desert held everything that had happened in the dark. And the dark was over now. And the people who were supposed to be alive were alive, and the warthog was on the ground, in the condition of something that has given everything it had and is resting now, and the patch that had been close to her chest for 26 years was in her brother's hand where it was supposed to be. James Mercer had flown for the men on the ground who needed someone overhead. His daughter had done the same. The morning was proof of it. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.